Clara Whitmore pressed a bleeding thumb to her lips and did not cry out, not from pain, but because 3 years of grief had taught her no one was listening anyway. A widow shunned by her own town, she kept one lantern burning each night for a family that would never walk through her door again. Then, a storm dragged a broken stranger onto her step, and everything she thought she knew about being forgotten was about to change forever. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay with me all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Clara Whitmore drove the sewing needle straight through her own fingertip and did not make a sound. She watched the blood well up dark and slow in the lamplight, and she thought of Annie's small hand wrapped around hers, and she thought of Matthew's voice saying her name the way no one said it anymore, and she pressed her thumb hard against the wound until the sting became the only thing she could feel. Pain she could manage. Pain had rules. Grief did not. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge like something with teeth, and Mercy Ridge braced itself for a storm that had been building since noon. Clara set the needle down. She lit the lantern in the window same as she had every night for 3 years, and she did not let herself wonder why she still did it, because if she let herself wonder she would have to answer, and the answer would break her all over again. Someone pounded on the shop door. She startled, one hand flying to the counter, the other to her chest, and for one long moment she stood frozen in the small room full of half-finished dresses and spools of thread, listening to the storm scream and the door take another hit. "Shop's closed," she called out, though her voice cracked on the second word. "Ma'am?" A man's voice, rough as gravel, barely carrying over the wind. "I ain't looking for trouble. Saddle straps tore clean through and my horse is spooked half to death out here." Clara stood very still. Mercy Ridge had taught her to be afraid of strangers who came pounding after dark, taught her with sideways looks and closed doors, and a town full of people who had decided without ever saying it to her face that a widow who kept a light burning for a family that would never come home again was a woman not quite right in the head. But there was something in the voice, not begging, not threatening either, just tired, bone-deep tired, the kind she recognized because she carried the same weight herself. She crossed the room and opened the door 6 inches no more, and the wind shoved rain sideways into her face. The man standing there was soaked through, hat pulled low, a leather strap gripped in one fist like it was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't step forward. He didn't try to push past her. He just stood in the rain and waited like a man who'd learned a long time ago not to expect a door to open for him. "Please," he said. "Won't take but a few minutes of your time." Clara looked at his hands first, rough scarred but empty. Then she looked at his eyes, and something in them stopped her breath. Not danger, but a grief so deep and so carefully hidden that she recognized it the way one drowning person recognizes another. She opened the door the rest of the way. "Get in here before you catch your death," she said. "I'm not in the business of losing customers to pneumonia." He hesitated on the threshold, like the invitation itself was a thing he didn't trust. "Ma'am, you don't know me." "I know a torn saddle strap when I see one," Clara said, already moving toward her workbench, already reaching for her shears and her heaviest thread. "And I know a man's not likely to do much harm standing in my doorway, soaked to the bone and shaking. Come in or don't, but shut the door either way. You're letting the storm inside." Something almost like a laugh moved through him, quick and rusty, like a hinge that hadn't been used in years. He stepped inside and shut the door. "Name's Caleb Brooks," he said. "Clara Whitmore." She held out her hand for the strap without looking up, and after a beat, he set it in her palm. "Sit if you want. This won't take long, but I don't rush good stitching for anybody." He didn't sit. He stood near the door hat, still on water, dripping off the brim onto her floor, and he watched her work with the kind of attention men usually saved for something they were afraid to lose. "You always take in strangers past dark, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs." She corrected, quiet. "And no, I don't take in much of anything anymore." The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt her own face go hot, felt the old shame crawl up her neck, the way it always did when she said too much, when she let some sliver of the truth slip out where a stranger could see it and judge her for it, same as the whole town already had. But Caleb Brooks didn't ask. He didn't press her for the story. Didn't tilt his head with that particular pity she'd learned to hate more than cruelty itself. He just nodded slow, like a man who understood exactly what it cost a person to say even that much. And he looked away out the rain-streaked window, giving her back the privacy she hadn't asked for, but desperately needed. "Storm's a mean one," he said instead. "Caught me 2 miles out. Horse near threw me twice. Where were you headed?" "Nowhere in particular." He said it plain, no self-pity in it, just fact. "I go where the work is. Ranch hand, mostly. Fence work, cattle drives, whatever pays, and don't ask too many questions." Clara's needle moved fast and sure through the leather, her hand steady, even though her heart was doing something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. A kind of quickening she hadn't felt in 3 years. Not fear, but something close enough to it that she almost mistrusted it. "That's a lonely way to live," she said. "So is this," Caleb said, nodding at the shop around them, the dresses hanging half-made, the single chair pulled up to a table set for one, the lantern burning steady in the window. Even though there was no earthly reason for a lantern to burn in a shop window past closing on a stormy night. "Unless I'm wrong." Clara's hands stilled. For 3 years, no one in Mercy Ridge had said a true thing to her face. They whispered it behind her back. Poor Clara, still keeping that light burning, still setting a place at the table. Some nights still can't let go, but not one soul had looked her in the eye and simply named what she was. Lonely. She could have thrown him out right then. She could have told him the strap was fixed, "Here's your horse, good night," and locked the door behind him and gone back to her needle and her silence and the particular familiar ache of being unseen. Instead, she looked up. "You always this direct with women you just met?" "No, ma'am." He met her eyes and there was no apology in it, only a kind of raw honesty that felt to Clara like the first honest thing anyone had offered her in longer than she could remember. "Truth is, I don't talk much to anybody. Something about you made it easy." The wind howled against the window. The lantern flame bent sideways in a draft, and then steadied. "That's a dangerous thing to tell a woman with a needle in her hand," Clara said, but there was no real bite in it, and she saw something shift in his face. Surprise, maybe that she'd answered him with something other than fear or offense. "Reckon I'll take my chances," he said. She finished the strap in silence. After that, the two of them settling into something that wasn't quite comfortable yet, but wasn't hostile either. A careful truce between two people who had each spent years building walls and weren't in any hurry to knock them down for a stranger met in a storm. When she tied off the last stitch and held the mended strap out to him, their fingers brushed for half a second, and Clara felt it like a spark jumping a gap. It had no business jumping. Caleb pulled back first quick, like he'd been burned. "Obliged to you, Mrs. Whitmore." He dug in his coat for coin, counted out more than she'd asked, and set it on the counter before she could argue. "For the trouble. And for the door." "It wasn't any trouble." "Wasn't nothing either," he said low. "Most folks in this town wouldn't have opened that door for a stranger past dark. I know how Mercy Ridge looks at outsiders. Looked at me plenty already riding in." Clara's jaw tightened. "This town looks at a lot of people the wrong way." Something passed between them then, quick and unspoken, the recognition of two people who'd both been on the receiving end of a town's cold judgment, though for entirely different reasons, and neither of them explained further, and neither of them needed to. Caleb settled his hat lower and reached for the door. "Storm'll blow through by morning," he said. "I'll be moving on soon as it does. Won't trouble you again." "You're not any trouble," Clara said again, and this time she meant something more by it than the words alone carried, and she saw him hear it, saw something flicker behind his tired eyes before he shuddered it away again. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Brooks." He stepped out into the rain and was gone, swallowed by the dark and the storm, and Clara stood in the doorway a long moment before she shut it, latched it, and turned back to the empty shop. The lantern still burned in the window. She looked at it a long time that night, longer than she had in months, and for the first time since she'd started the ritual, She did not know exactly what she was keeping the light burning for. Morning broke pale and washed clean over Mercy Ridge. The storm gone as quickly as it had come, leaving the streets slick with mud and the air smelling of wet pine and turned earth. Clara opened her shop at the same hour she always did, swept her step, and told herself firmly that a torn saddle strap and a stranger's tired eyes meant nothing at all. She was still telling herself that when she saw him across the street 3 days later. Caleb Brooks hadn't left Mercy Ridge. He'd taken work at the Dawson Spread on the edge of town, mending fence and breaking horses for wages, and though he never came near her shop again, never knocked on her door, never gave her the smallest excuse to speak to him, Clara found herself noticing him anyway, riding past in the early morning, tipping his hat to no one in particular. Always alone, always watching the town, the way a man watches something he doesn't trust to leave him be. She told herself she was not watching for him. She told herself that every single day, and every single day, it became a little less true. "You're staring again," said Ruth Dawson one afternoon, leaning in the shop doorway with a basket of mending balanced on her hip. Ruth was one of the few women in town who still spoke to Clara like a person and not a curiosity, and for that alone, Clara loved her fiercely. "That drifter my husband hired, Caleb somebody." "I am not staring," Clara said, snapping a thread with more force than the task required. Ruth's eyes danced. "Man rides past this shop 4 or 5 times a week, ma'am, and it surely ain't for the scenery of Widow Whitmore's window display." "Ruth, I'm only saying what half the town's already saying. Clara might as well hear it from a friend first." Ruth's teasing softened just slightly. "It's good to see you look at something besides that lantern for once." The words landed harder than Ruth meant them to, and Clara's hands stilled over the fabric. "That lantern is not a burden to anyone," Clara said, quiet but firm. "Least of all me." Ruth had the grace to look sorry. "I know it, honey. I didn't mean—" "I know what you meant." Clara softened too, because Ruth's heart had always been kind, even when her mouth ran ahead of it. "It's all right, truly. Go on home before Silas wonders where his mending's got to." But after Ruth left, Clara stood a long while at the window, watching the empty street where Caleb Brooks had ridden past not 20 minutes before, and she let herself just for a moment wonder what it might be like to be looked at by someone who did not know enough about her to pity her. It did not take long for Harlan Pike to notice the same thing the rest of the town had started to notice. Harlan owned the Mercantile, the feed store, and no small portion of the bank's paper on half the ranches in the valley, and he had built his fortune the way certain men always did, quietly, patiently, through debts called in at exactly the wrong moment, and land bought for pennies from families too desperate to argue the price. He had also, for 3 years, made it his particular hobby to remind Clara Whitmore of her place in Mercy Ridge, and her place in Harlan's estimation was small, quiet, and grateful for whatever scraps of the town's tolerance she was permitted to keep. He found her in the Mercantile on a Thursday, counting coin for thread and buttons, and he leaned against the counter with the easy proprietary air of a man who believed the whole world owed him room to spread out in. "Heard you had a visitor," Harlan said. "Storm night. Man showed up at your door past dark." Clara did not look up from her counting. "He needed a saddle strap mended, Mr. Pike. It's my trade." "Course it is." Harlan's smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did. "Awful late hour for trade, though. Wouldn't you say, woman alone, letting a strange man into her shop after dark?" "Folks talk, Clara. You, of all people, ought to know how this town talks." "Folks have talked about me for 3 years," Clara said, and her voice did not shake though her hands wanted to. "I expect they'll find something new to talk about eventually. Maybe?" Harlan leaned closer, lowering his voice to something meant to sound like concern and landing instead on something closer to threat. "Or maybe a woman keeping a shop on her own, letting drifters in and out at all hours, starts to look like the kind of establishment decent families don't want their daughters walking past. I'd hate for that kind of talk to hurt your business, Clara. I truly would." "Is that a warning, Mr. Pike?" "It's a kindness," Harlan said, straightening his coat. "From a neighbor who remembers you were somebody once before all this." He gestured vague and cutting at the shop at her, at the whole shape of the life she'd built, out of the wreckage of the one she'd lost. Matthew would hate to see what's become of you." Clara's breath caught like a fist had closed around her throat. He knew exactly where to cut. He always did. She said nothing. She counted her coin, paid for her thread, and walked out of the mercantile with her spine straight and her chin high, and she did not let herself cry until she was 3 streets away and certain no one could see her. She did not see Caleb Brooks standing just outside the mercantile door, hat low, having heard every single word. It was 2 days later, on a bright ordinary Tuesday, that Harlan Pike made his second attempt. He came to Clara's shop directly, this time no pretense of business, and he brought 2 of his hired men with him, not to do anything exactly, just to stand in the doorway taking up space, making the small shop feel suddenly much smaller, making Clara feel for the first time in a long while, genuinely afraid in her own place of work. "I've been thinking on our conversation," Harlan said, strolling the length of her workbench, running one finger along a bolt of blue calico like he was already pricing it for himself. "About your situation here, this building. You know the lease on this shop runs through my bank, same as most everything else in this town. I've never missed a payment, Mr. Pike." "No, you haven't." He turned to face her, and his smile was thin as a knife blade. "But leases can be reconsidered. Terms can change. A woman with your particular reputation in this town might find it harder than she expects to keep good standing with her creditors." "Say what you mean." "I mean," Harlan said, stepping closer, close enough that Clara had to fight the urge to step back to give ground she'd sworn to herself. Years ago, she'd never give again. That a smart woman in your position would consider selling this shop to me now on generous terms before her reputation makes the decision for her. "I'm offering you a kindness, Clara. I'd hate to see you lose everything for pride." "I am not selling my shop." "We'll see." The bell over the door rang. Caleb Brooks stepped inside, unhurried, hat tipped just enough to shade his eyes, and he did not say a word. He simply walked to the counter, stood beside Clara, not in front of her, not shielding her like she needed protecting, but beside her like a man taking up his rightful place. And he looked at Harlan Pike with an expression so calm, so utterly without fear, that it did more to silence the room than any shout could have. "Mr. Brooks." Harlan's smile flickered. "This doesn't concern you." "Didn't say it did." Caleb's voice was low, even unhurried. "Just came in for thread. Mrs. Whitmore does good work. Figured I'd let her get to it." "We're in the middle of business. Looked to me like you were in the middle of leaving," Caleb said, and though his tone never rose, never sharpened into anything a man could rightly call a threat, something in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his hands, the sheer immovable quiet of him, made it clear to every soul in that room that he was not going anywhere until Harlan Pike did. Harlan's 2 hired men shifted, glancing at each other, glancing at their employer, waiting for a signal that didn't come. Whatever Harlan Pike was, he was not a fool. And he was not a man who fought battles he wasn't certain to win. "This isn't finished, Clara," Harlan said, gathering the last of his dignity around him like a coat. "Think on what I said." He left. His men followed. The bell rang again, and then the shop was quiet, and Clara realized her hands were shaking so hard she'd dropped her shears. Caleb bent and picked them up before she could, and set them gently on the counter, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. "You didn't have to do that," Clara finally managed. "Didn't do much of anything," Caleb said. "Bought some thread, didn't even pick a color yet." A laugh startled out of her, small and disbelieving. The first real laugh she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit, and something in Caleb's face softened at the sound of it, like he'd been given something he hadn't known he was hungry for. "Blue," Clara said, wiping at her eyes, half laughing and half something closer to tears. "You need the blue calico. It'll hold up better to a man who mends fence for a living." "Blue it is, then." She wrapped the thread with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and when she held it out to him, she found herself not wanting him to leave, found herself searching for some reason, any reason, to keep him standing in her shop a few minutes longer. "Mr. Brooks." "Ma'am." "Have you eaten?" The question hung in the air between them, simple as anything, and yet it landed like the heaviest thing either of them had said since the night of the storm. Caleb went very still, and for a moment Clara feared she'd overstepped, feared she'd handed him some intimacy he hadn't asked for and didn't want. "Can't say I have," he said finally. "Not since sunup. I've got stew on this back stove, more than enough for one." She busied her hands with tidying thread she didn't need to tidy, unable to look at him directly while she said it. Wouldn't want it to go to waste. Caleb Brooks looked at her for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that Clara couldn't quite name. Disbelief, maybe, that anyone would offer him a kindness with no debt attached to it, no price expected in return. "I'd be obliged, Mrs. Whitmore." "Clara," she said, "if we're sharing a table, you might as well use my name." "Clara," he said, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth, and something in the way he said it made her chest ache in a way she hadn't let herself feel in 3 long years. She led him to the back room where a small table sat set for one, same as it had every night since she'd lost her family and for the first time since she'd started that lonely ritual. She pulled a second chair to the table and did not feel like she was betraying anyone by doing it. They ate in near silence. At first the good kind of silence, the kind that didn't need filling, and it was Caleb who finally broke it, staring down into his bowl, like the words cost him something to say. "You never asked me why I left racing." Clara's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "You said you didn't talk much to anybody." "I don't." He turned the bowl slowly between his hands. "There was a boy, younger rider hardly more than a kid racing against me at a fair outside Abilene 3 years back. I was ahead. I was always ahead back then, and I got greedy cut in tighter than I should have, and his horse went down." His jaw tightened. Boy went down with it. Didn't walk right for a long while after. Maybe don't still. "Caleb, I quit racing that day," he said, like he hadn't heard her, like the confession, once started, had to run its whole course before it would let him go. "Been drifting since. Ranch work, fence work, whatever keeps my hands busy enough, I don't have to think too hard on it. Man like me don't get to put down roots, Clara. Don't reckon I've earned that." Clara set down her spoon. "I lost my husband in a mine collapse," she said, quiet, giving him truth for truth the way it seemed only right to do. "And my daughter to a fever not 4 months after. I light that lantern every night because I promised Annie I'd always leave a light on for her to find her way home by, and I promised Matthew the same, and some nights I don't know if I'm still keeping that promise, or if I've just gone half mad, clinging to something that's never coming back." "That's not mad," Caleb said low. "That's just grief with nowhere else to go." "Then I suppose you and I are the same kind of foolish," Clara said, and something in her chest, some old tight fist she'd carried 3 years without knowing its name, loosened just slightly at the saying of it. "Reckon we are," Caleb said, and for the first time since the storm, he smiled small and real, and Clara found herself smiling back before she'd even decided to. Outside, the lantern in the front window burned steady against the coming dark, and for the first time in 3 long years, Clara Whitmore did not feel entirely alone while it did. The weeks that followed took on a shape Clara hadn't dared to hope for. Caleb came by most evenings after his work at the Dawson spread was done, never presuming, always finding some small errand to justify the visit. A torn glove that needed mending a button. Lost off his one good shirt, a length of rope he claimed needed measuring, though Clara suspected he could have measured it himself blindfolded. She let him keep his excuses. She understood better than most the particular dignity a person needed to hold on to when they weren't ready to say the truer thing out loud. "You're going to run out of things needing fixed," she told him one evening, holding up a shirt cuff that had clearly been torn on purpose, the stitch pulled loose with careful, deliberate fingers. Caleb had the grace to look sheepish, an expression that sat strangely on a face built mostly for guardedness. "Man's shirt takes a beating mending fence all day." Clara threaded her needle without looking at him, fighting a smile. "Funny how it's always this same shirt. Only got the one good shirt, Clara." "Then maybe you ought to take better care of it." "Maybe I like the company more than I mind the mending," he said quiet, and Clara's hand stilled on the fabric, because it was the closest either of them had come to naming the thing that had been growing between them, slow and careful, like something neither of them trusted enough yet to call by its right name. She didn't answer that directly. She didn't know how. 3 years of grief had built walls in her that didn't come down, just because a gentle man with tired eyes had started sitting at her table most evenings. And some nights, the old guilt crept back in. Anyway. Guilt that she could feel anything at all, besides sorrow. Guilt that laughing with Caleb Brooks over stew and mended shirts felt some nights like a betrayal of the family she'd buried. She told him as much one night when the confession came easier than she expected. "Sometimes I feel like I'm not allowed this," she said, staring down at her hands. "Like every evening I spend not grieving is an evening I'm stealing from Matthew and Annie." Caleb was quiet a long moment before he answered. "I used to think the same," he said. "Thought the only fair thing I could do for that boy I hurt was make sure I never let myself have anything good again. Spent 3 years proving it to myself one lonely town at a time." He looked at her steady, unflinching. "Took me a long while to figure out that ain't honoring anybody. That's just punishing yourself and calling it grief." "That's a hard thing to hear." "Didn't say it to be easy," Caleb said. "Said it because I think you already know it's true, same as I do." Clara didn't answer. But she didn't argue either, and that for her was its own kind of admission. Not everyone in Mercy Ridge watched the growing friendship with Ruth Dawson's easy warmth. Harlan Pike watched it with the sharp, calculating patience of a man assembling a weapon. He began small, the way he always did. A word dropped here. A raised eyebrow there. A comment at the mercantile counter about how peculiar it was a widow keeping company with a drifter. Nobody knew the first thing about a man who'd shown up in a storm with no history and no family to vouch for his character. Harlan never said anything outright cruel. He never needed to. He simply planted the seed and let Mercy Ridge's own appetite for gossip do the rest of the work for him. "Strange, don't you think?" Harlan said to a gathering of men outside the feed store, loud enough to carry, "A man like that, no people, no past worth speaking of, taking such particular interest in a lonely widow with a shop and a bit of property to her name. Makes a person wonder what exactly he's after." Now Harlan. Old Mr. Findlay started uncertain. "The Whitmore woman's never given anybody cause. I'm not accusing anybody of anything." Harlan said, all false reasonableness hands spread wide and innocent. "Just saying a smart town keeps its eyes open. Strangers ride in all the time claiming to be honest men. Don't always turn out that way." The seed took root, the way seeds like that always did, in a town small enough to feed on its own whispers. By the following Sunday, Clara felt it the moment she stepped into church, the way conversations dipped low as she passed. The way eyes slid away rather than meet hers, the particular suffocating silence of a room that has already decided something about you and simply hasn't said it to your face yet. She held her chin high through the whole service. She had learned in 3 years of widowhood exactly how to carry herself through a room full of quiet judgment, and she did not let herself crumble, not once. Not until she was home behind her own locked door, with the lantern unlit and the afternoon sun still bright outside. Then she cried hard and furious alone at her workbench, until she heard the bell over her shop door, and looked up to find Caleb standing there, hat in his hands, having clearly heard something of what was being whispered around town. "They're saying things," she said before he could ask, wiping angrily at her face. "About you, about us. About what kind of woman lets a stranger sit at her table most every night." "I heard some of it," Caleb said quietly. "I won't have you dragged into my troubles, Caleb. This town's already decided what to think of me. I won't let it ruin your name too on top of everything. Clara." He crossed the room, slow, careful the way a man approaches something wounded and skittish, and he stopped close enough that she had to look up at him close enough that she could see the whole steady weight of his sincerity in his face. "I've had my name ruined by better men than Harlan Pike, and I lived through it. Man like me drifting from town to town with nothing but a horse and a guilty conscience, I got nothing left for gossip to take from me. But you built something here. A shop, a home, a whole life out of the wreckage of the one you lost, and I'll be damned if I let some small jealous man tear it down over nothing more than spite and greed. You don't know that it's just spite. I know Harlan Pike's been buying up half this valley one desperate family at a time," Caleb said, and something hard entered his voice. something Clara hadn't heard from him before. "I've seen men like him in every town I've ever passed through. They don't spread rumors for the sport of it, Clara. They spread rumors because it softens people up before the real trouble starts." Clara felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the evening air. "What kind of trouble?" "Don't know yet," Caleb admitted. "But I aim to find out before it finds you first." He reached out hesitant and closed his hand gently over hers, where it rested on the counter between them, not gripping, not demanding, just present, just there the way his whole self had been there since the night of the storm, steady and unhurried and asking nothing in return. "You're not in this alone anymore, Clara," he said. "Whatever Harlan Pike's building toward, he's going to have to go through me to get to you." Clara looked down at their joined hands, work-roughened and scarred. Both of them marked by loss in ways the whole town could see, and ways it couldn't. And she felt something inside her chest crack open, not with pain this time, but with something warmer, something that had been frozen solid for 3 long years, and was only now cautiously beginning to thaw. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to let myself want something again." "Don't reckon anybody knows how to do that," Caleb said. "Figure most folks just do it scared and hope it's worth the risk." Outside, the evening settled gold and quiet over Mercy Ridge, and inside the small shop with its half-finished dresses and its lantern waiting to be lit, 2 broken people stood with their hands joined, neither one of them running, both of them choosing for the first time in a long while to stay. The lantern burned in the window that night, same as always. But when Clara looked at it this time, lighting the wick with careful hands, while Caleb watched from across the room, she found she was no longer entirely certain the light was only for the family she'd lost. Some small tentative part of it, she realized, had begun burning for whatever she and Caleb Brooks might yet become. It was Sheriff Wade Cole who first noticed something worth a lawman's attention. Cole had kept the peace in Mercy Ridge for 11 years, long enough to know every family's history, and most of their secrets besides, and long enough to have grown deeply suspicious of exactly how much land Harlan Pike had managed to acquire in that same span of time. He said as much to Caleb one afternoon outside the jailhouse, the 2 men falling into an easy, wary respect for each other, despite Cole's initial hesitation over an unknown drifter's sudden interest in the town's business. "Pike's bought up 6 parcels in the last 2 years alone," Cole said, leaning against the porch post, watching the street with the careful eyes of a man who noticed things. "Every one of them from a family that hit hard times right around the time Pike's bank happened to call in their notes. Widows mostly, or families with a husband recently passed." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Like Clara. Whitmore land's been in her husband's family 3 generations, Cole said. "Matthew Whitmore never took a loan from Harlan's bank that I ever heard of. Man was careful that way. Careful in a lot of ways from what I recall of him. But," Cole's eyes cut sideways, weighing something, "but there's paper on file at the county recorder's office says otherwise. Filed the month before Matthew died in that mine collapse. I always thought it looked strange. Never had cause to dig deeper till now." Caleb felt something cold settle low in his gut, the particular dread of a man watching a threat take shape before he had any way yet to stop it. "You think Pike's after her shop? I think Harlan Pike's been patient a long time," Cole said. "And patient men don't stir themselves over nothing. Man wants that land bad enough to spend 2 years softening up the whole town's opinion of the woman sitting on it. That tells me the land itself is worth considerably more to him than a widow's little dress shop ought to be." "Why?" "Don't know yet," Cole admitted. "But I aim to find out, same as you, I expect." The 2 men shared a look that carried the particular understanding of men who had each in their own separate ways decided to stand between Clara Whitmore and whatever storm was building against her, and neither of them said anything further because neither of them needed to. That evening, Clara found Caleb standing outside her shop, long after his usual hour, staring down the darkened street toward the Mercantile with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not sorrow, not guardedness, but something harder, something protective, something that looked for the first time since she'd met him entirely unafraid. "You've got a look on you," she said, stepping out onto the step beside him. "Talked to the sheriff today." "About Harlan?" About some old paper filed at the county office, Caleb said. Cole thinks there might be more to this than a jealous man spreading rumors, Clara. Thinks Harlan's after your land specific, and thinks he's had his eye on it a good deal longer than either of us realized. Clara wrapped her arms tight around herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Matthew never borrowed a cent from that bank. He was proud that way. Said a man who owed nothing owed no one an explanation. Cole says there's paper says otherwise. Filed the month before Matthew passed. The words landed like a stone, dropped into still water ripples, spreading out through every certainty Clara had built her grief around for 3 long years. She had told herself all this time that Matthew's death had been simple, terrible misfortune, a mine collapse, an accident. Nothing more sinister than the ordinary cruelty of a dangerous trade. The thought that there might be more beneath it, some deliberate hand at work in the shape of her sorrow, was almost more than she could hold steady in her mind. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would anyone forge paper against a dead man? Don't know yet, Caleb said, and he turned to face her, fully taking both her hands in his, steady, despite the trembling he could feel in her fingers. But I promise you this, Clara Whitmore. Whatever Harlan Pike's been building toward whatever he thinks he's owed off your grief and your good name, he's going to have to answer for it. To the sheriff, to this whole town if it comes to that, and to me personal before any of the rest of it. You barely know me, Caleb. Reckon I know enough, he said, quiet and certain. Know you opened a door for a stranger in a storm when the whole town would have turned him away. Know you asked a lonely man if he'd eaten before you asked him a single question about himself. Know you've carried 3 years of grief with more grace than most folks manage in a lifetime. And you did it alone with a whole town too small and too scared to stand beside you. His grip tightened, gentle but sure. That's enough knowing far as I'm concerned. Enough to know you're worth standing beside now. Clara felt the tears come before she could stop them. Not the bitter, lonely tears of the church pew or the mercantile counter, but something different. Grief and hope tangled together so tight she couldn't have separated them if she'd tried. I'm afraid, she admitted, of what he's planning, of what it might cost to fight him. I know, and I'm afraid of this, she said, looking down at their joined hands, of wanting something again after everything, of losing it the way I lost everything else. Then we'll be afraid together, Caleb said. Reckon that's better than being afraid alone. I've done enough of that to know the difference. The lantern burned steady in the window behind them, casting its small, stubborn light out into the darkening street, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke, the two of them simply standing together on the threshold of a shop that had weathered 3 years of solitary grief and was only now cautiously learning to hold something more than sorrow inside its walls. Somewhere across town, in the lit window of his fine house on the hill, Harlan Pike sat at his desk, poring over old paper and older schemes, utterly unaware that the widow he'd marked as an easy target had found in a storm-soaked stranger with nothing to his name but a torn saddle strap and a guilty conscience. Exactly the kind of steady, unshakable ally he had never accounted for. The fight that was coming would test everything Clara Whitmore believed about her own strength and everything Caleb Brooks believed about his own worth to stay rather than run. But standing together in the lantern light, hands joined against the coming dark, neither one of them was running yet. Ruth Dawson found Clara at the shop 2 mornings later, and the moment she stepped through the door, she knew something had shifted. You look different, Ruth said, setting her basket down. Slow, studying Clara's face the way old friends do when they're searching for the shape of a thing not yet spoken aloud. Different, how? Lighter. Ruth tilted her head. Scared too underneath it, but lighter. Clara busied her hands with a bolt of cloth she didn't need to touch. Harlan's been spreading talk about me, about Caleb. I've heard. Ruth's mouth thinned. Silas heard it too out at the feed store. Man's got half the town convinced there's something improper going on, and the other half too scared of losing their credit at his bank to say different. It isn't improper, Clara said, quieter than she meant to. Didn't say it was honey. Ruth crossed the room and took Clara's hands, stilling their restless movement over the fabric. I've known you 6 years, Clara Whitmore. I watched you bury a husband and a daughter both, and I watched this whole town turn its back on you for grieving too long or too loud, or not the way they thought proper. If some part of you has found a reason to feel something other than sorrow again, I say thank God for it, and Harlan Pike can keep his opinions to himself. Clara's eyes stung. I don't know what I'm doing, Ruth. I don't know if I'm allowed this. Nobody's granting permission for happiness around here, sweetheart. You take it where you find it, or you spend your whole life waiting on a permission that never comes. Ruth squeezed her hands once firm. That man's put himself between you and Harlan Pike's meanness twice now that I've heard of. That's not nothing. That's a man showing you exactly what he's made of, plain as anything. Cole thinks Harlan's after the land itself. Thinks there's forged paper, says Matthew owed the bank money he never borrowed. Ruth's face went carefully still. That's a serious thing to say about a man like Harlan Pike. I know it. You be careful, Clara. Man like that cornered, he won't go quiet. He'll come at you with everything he's got, and this town's shown you plenty of times already. It won't necessarily stand at your back when he does. I know that too, Clara said, and found to her own surprise that the knowing didn't frighten her the way it once would have. 3 years of quiet grief had taught her how to survive being unseen and unwanted by the very town she called home. Whatever fight was coming, she suspected she had already survived worse alone, and she would not be facing this one alone at all. That night, after Ruth had gone and the shop had gone dark and quiet, Clara sat a long while at her workbench, with Matthew's old ledger open in front of her, the one she kept from his mining days, searching through cramped, careful handwriting for anything that might explain what Sheriff Cole had found. Some hint her husband might have left behind if he'd known somehow that trouble was coming for the land he'd worked so hard to keep clear of debt. She found nothing that night. But she found tucked into the ledger's back cover a single pressed wildflower dried and flattened with age, and beneath it in Matthew's own hand 4 words that stopped her heart entirely. For Clara, always safe. She did not know not yet exactly what her husband had meant to protect her from, or how deep the danger Harlan Pike represented truly ran. But she understood, holding that small pressed flower in trembling hands, that Matthew had left her more than grief when he died. He had left her a promise unfinished, waiting for her to find the strength to see it through. She lit the lantern that night with steadier hands than she had in 3 long years, and when she looked out at the dark street beyond her window, she found she was no longer looking for the family she'd lost. She was looking for whatever came next, and for the first time since the mine collapse that had taken her whole world apart, she found she was not afraid to meet it. The stone came through the window 3 nights later, wrapped in a scrap of paper, and thrown hard enough to shatter glass clean across the workbench where Clara had been sitting not 10 minutes before. She screamed before she even understood what had happened. Glass biting into her forearm where she'd thrown it up to shield her face. And for one terrible disoriented second, she thought the roof itself had come down on her, the way the mine had come down on Matthew. Then she saw the stone lying among the shards, the paper still wrapped around it, and her heart dropped somewhere lower than her stomach. She unwrapped it with shaking hands. Leave town, whore, or burn with it. The words blurred in front of her eyes. She sat down hard on the floor amid the broken glass, not caring that it cut into her palms, and she stayed there frozen until she heard boots pounding down the street outside and Caleb's voice shouting her name with a fear in it she'd never heard from him before. He didn't wait for an answer. He came through the door with his revolver already drawn, sweeping the dark shop for a threat that had already fled into the night, and when he found her instead, sitting in glass and blood with a note crumpled in her fist, something in his face went white and still. Clara. He was on his knees beside her before she could speak, hands hovering over her arms like he was afraid touching her would break something already broken. Clara, look at me. Are you hurt bad? It's just glass, she managed. Just glass, Caleb, I'm all right. You are not all right. His voice cracked on the words raw in a way that frightened her more than the stone had. He took the note from her fist, and she watched his face change as he read it, watched the fear curdle into something harder, colder, more dangerous than she had ever seen on him. Who did this? He said. Not a question. a demand aimed at the whole dark night outside. "I don't know." "I know," Caleb said, and the words came out low and certain. "I don't need a signed confession to know whose hand is behind this, Clara. Harlan Pike's been building to something for weeks. This is him showing his teeth. You can't prove that. Don't need to prove it to know it." He was pulling glass shards gently from her sleeve, now his hands careful despite the fury still burning behind his eyes. "I need to prove it to the sheriff. That's a different matter entirely, and one I intend to see done." Clara flinched as he found a piece of glass buried deeper than the rest, and Caleb went still, immediately murmuring an apology, his fingers gentling further, and something about the careful, fierce tenderness of him undid the last of her composure. She began to cry hard, the sobs tearing out of her, in a way she hadn't allowed since the week she buried Annie. "I thought I was done being afraid," she gasped. "I thought 3 years of grief had used up every ounce of fear I had left in me." "Grief and fear ain't the same, well, Clara." Caleb gathered her against him, careful of the glass, careful of her, and held her while she shook. "Grief's for what you've already lost. Fear's for what you're still afraid of losing." His arms tightened. "And I'll be damned if I let this town take one more thing from you." They sat together on the floor of the ruined shop a long while, glass glittering around them in the lantern light, and slowly, Clara's sobs eased into something quieter, something that felt less like breaking and more like being held together. "I'm not leaving," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever he wants, whatever he thinks a broken window and an ugly note will accomplish, I built this shop with my own 2 hands after I buried everything else I ever loved. I am not giving it up for Harlan Pike or anybody else." Caleb pulled back just enough to look at her, and something in his expression shifted from fury into something that looked almost like awe. "There she is," he said quiet. "What? The woman who opened her door to a stranger in a storm, 'cause she wasn't afraid to." His thumb brushed gentle across her cheek, wiping away a tear track. "Been wondering where she went these last few days, under all that fright. Glad to see she ain't gone nowhere." Clara let out a wet, unsteady laugh despite herself. "I nearly lost my mind 10 minutes ago, Caleb." "Nearly," he agreed. "Not the same as did." Sheriff Cole came at first light, examining the broken window. The stone, the note with the grim, methodical patience of a man who had seen this particular kind of cowardice before and hated it every time. "Whoever threw this didn't leave much behind," Cole said, turning the stone over in his weathered hands. "No boot prints worth tracking, rained out by morning dew. Whoever it was, they knew enough to do this quiet and disappear quick." "It's Harlan!" Caleb said flat. No room for argument in it. "I expect you're right," Cole said, surprising them both. "But expecting and proving are 2 different animals. Caleb and I can't arrest a man on a hunch, however strong that hunch might be. I need something that'll hold up something a judge in the county seat won't laugh me out of his courtroom over." "So we do nothing," Clara said, bitter. "We do plenty," Cole corrected, gentle but firm. "I'll post a man near your shop nights best I'm able with the deputies I've got. And I mean to ride out to the county recorder myself, dig into that paper on your husband's land proper, see what I can turn up that might tie back to Pike's hand in a way a court can't ignore." He set the stone down on her counter, grim. "This kind of cowardice, throwing rocks in the dark, sending threats under cover of night, that tells me Harlan Pike's getting desperate, Clara. Desperate men make mistakes. We just need patience enough to catch him in one." "Patience," Clara repeated hollow. "While he threatens to burn me out of my own home." "I know it's a hard thing to ask," Cole said. "But rash moves against a man like Pike without proof solid enough to hold will only give him more ammunition to paint you and Caleb both as troublemakers this town can't trust. We do this right or we don't do it at all." Clara wanted to argue. Every instinct in her screamed to march straight to Harlan Pike's fine house on the hill and demand he answer for the terror he'd rained down on her, but she recognized the wisdom in Cole's caution even through her fury, and she forced herself to nod. "Patience." She agreed, though the word tasted like ash. The town's reaction to the broken window split Mercy Ridge clean in 2. Some folks, quiet ones, mostly left small kindnesses at Clara's mended door over the following days. A basket of eggs from the Hendersons. A jar of preserves from a woman Clara barely knew. Small gestures of solidarity that arrived without note or explanation, as though the givers feared even the appearance of standing with her too openly. Others were not so quiet in their disapproval. "Ought not to be surprised," Clara overheard one woman say to another outside the church, not troubling to lower her voice as Clara passed. "Woman keeps company with a drifter nobody knows the first thing about. What does she expect? Man like that brings trouble wherever he goes." "Maybe she brought the trouble on herself," the other woman replied, and Clara kept walking spine straight, chin high, though the words landed like fresh stones thrown at a window already cracked. She told Caleb about it that evening and watched his jaw tighten with a fury he was visibly working to keep leashed. "They'd rather believe I brought violence to their town," he said low, "than believe one of their own neighbors is capable of throwing a rock through a widow's window." "People believe what's easiest to believe," Clara said, tired. "It's easier to blame the stranger than to admit the respectable banker they do business with every week might be a monster underneath his fine coat. Don't make it right." "No," Clara agreed. "It doesn't." They sat together in the quiet of her shop, the mended window still bearing a faint crack where the glazier hadn't quite matched the old glass, and Clara found herself studying Caleb's profile in the lantern light, the hard line of his jaw, the careful way he held himself even at rest, like a man who'd spent so many years bracing for the next blow that he'd forgotten how to simply exist without expecting one. "Caleb. Why do you stay truly?" She twisted her hands in her lap. "You could ride out tomorrow. Leave this whole ugly mess behind. You find work in some town that's never heard the name Harlan Pike, never whispered about a lonely widow and her lantern. Nobody would blame you for it." Caleb was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard from him before. 3 years ago, I left a boy broken in the dirt outside Abilene, and I rode away from that too," he said. "Told myself there wasn't nothing I could do to fix it, so running was the only decent option left to me. Spent every day since telling myself the same lie in a dozen different towns every time something got difficult or something got close." He turned to look at her fully. "I'm done running, Clara. Whatever it costs me to stay this time, I'd rather pay it than spend one more year of my life proving to myself I'm the kind of man who leaves." Clara's breath caught. "That's a heavy thing to put on staying with me." "Ain't staying with you that's heavy," Caleb said. "Staying with you is the first thing in 3 years that's felt light. It's everything else that's heavy. Harlan, the town, whatever's buried in that old paper Cole's chasing down." His hand found hers steady. "But you, Clara Whitmore, you're not the weight. You're the reason the weight's worth carrying." She didn't have words for that. She simply leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they sat together in the lantern light while the mended crack in the window caught the flame and split it into small fractured rainbows across the floor. The fire came 8 days later. Clara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of the Dawson's dog barking itself hoarse 2 streets over, and for one confused, half-asleep moment, she thought she was dreaming the mine collapse all over again. The acrid smell of char and dust filling her nose, the way it had the night they'd told her Matthew wasn't coming home. Then she heard the shouting real and immediate, and she was out of bed and down the stairs before her mind had fully caught up to her body. The back storeroom was ablaze, flames licking hungrily up the wall where someone had piled dry kindling against the old wood siding and set it alight, and the smoke was already thick enough to choke on by the time Clara reached the bottom of the stairs. She grabbed the water bucket by pure instinct, and it was Caleb's shout from the alley that stopped her from running straight into the smoke. "Clara, get out! Get out now!" He came around the side of the building at a dead run, having seen the glow from the Dawson spread, where he'd taken to bunking closer to town since the stone through the window, and he hauled her bodily back from the door before she could think to argue, shouting for help toward the neighboring houses with a voice that carried like a rifle shot through the still night air. Men came running in nightshirts and boots. Buckets passed hand to hand from the well, and it took the better part of an hour of frantic smoke-choked work before the flames guttered low enough to call the worst of the danger past. The storeroom was ruined. Half the back wall, scorched black months of fabric and supplies lost to ash and cinder, but the front of the shop, the workbench, the lantern still sitting cold and unlit in the window had survived. Clara stood in the wreckage of her storeroom as dawn broke gray and smoke-stained over Mercy Ridge, and she felt something in her chest that was not quite grief and not quite fury, but some terrible combination of both. "They tried to burn me alive in my own home," she said, hollow staring at the blackened wall. "They tried," Caleb said, soot-streaked and grim beside her, "and they failed. You're standing here, Clara. Whatever they meant to accomplish, you're still standing." Sheriff Cole arrived within the hour, and this time his examination of the scene carried a different weight, a grimmer set to his jaw. "This wasn't some coward tossing a rock in the dark," Cole said, crouching at the edge of the scorched wall, studying the pattern of the burn with a lawman's careful eye. "Somebody piled kindling here, deliberate, set it close against dry wood where it'd catch fast and burn hot before anybody had a chance to notice. This was meant to do real damage, Clara. Maybe worse." "Maybe worse, how?" Clara said, though she already knew the answer and dreaded hearing it spoken aloud. "You slept upstairs," Cole said, quiet. "Fire like this caught early enough might have just cost you your storeroom. Caught later with you asleep and the smoke thick before anybody smelled it." He didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. Clara's knees went weak, and it was Caleb's arm that caught her before she folded entirely. "This has gone past rumors and rocks," Caleb said, his voice low and dangerous, in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before, not even the night of the stone. "This is attempted murder, Cole, however careful Harlan Pike's been to keep his own hands clean of it." "I know it," Cole said. "And I mean to see him answer for it, but I still need proof enough to make an arrest stick, or he'll have his lawyer friends in the county seat tossing the charges out before the ink's dry on the warrant." "How much proof does a man need," Caleb demanded, "before this town admits a woman nearly burned alive in her own bed last night? I need the kind of proof that survives a courtroom, not just a conversation," Cole said, and though his voice stayed level, Clara could see the same fury simmering behind his composure that burned openly in Caleb's. "I rode out to the county recorder 3 days back, same as I told you I would. Found something interesting in those old land records, something that might just crack this whole business wide open if I can confirm it proper." "What did you find?" Clara asked, breath held. "Not ready to say yet," Cole admitted. "Don't want to raise hope on a thread that might snap before I've got it fully in hand. But I'll tell you this much. Clara Whitmore, whatever Harlan Pike thinks he's protecting, by scaring you off this land, I don't believe for 1 second it's simple spite over a friendship he don't approve of. There's something buried in that paperwork worth killing over, and I mean to dig it up before he tries this again." The words settled cold and heavy in Clara's stomach, and she looked toward the ruined storeroom, toward the black scorch mark, climbing the old wood like a scar that would never fully fade. And she understood with a clarity that frightened her more than the fire itself had, that she was no longer merely the target of a jealous man's petty cruelty. She was standing in the middle of something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever let herself imagine. Word of the fire spread through Mercy Ridge faster than the flames themselves had, and by midday, the town had split more sharply than ever into those who believed Clara Whitmore was a woman under genuine attack, and those who whispered with a cruelty that made Clara's stomach turn, that a woman keeping company with a rootless stranger ought to expect exactly this kind of trouble to follow her. Harlan Pike, for his part, arrived at the shop that afternoon with an expression of carefully composed sympathy that fooled no one who looked closely enough to see the satisfaction hiding underneath it. "Terrible business?" he said, surveying the scorched storeroom with a shake of his head that struck Clara as obscene in its falseness. "Truly terrible. A woman alone running a shop, no husband to protect the property properly. I did warn you, Clara, that your situation here left you more vulnerable than you cared to admit." "Get out of my shop, Mr. Pike. I only mean to help," Harlan said, spreading his hands wide, all false innocence. "I'll renew my offer, generous as before, to purchase this property from you outright. Save you the trouble and expense of rebuilding, save you the fear of wondering if the next fire finishes what this one started. A kindness, Clara, from a man who only wants to see you safe." "You set that fire," Clara said, and the words came out flat and certain. No longer a question, no longer a suspicion, carefully held back for lack of proof. Harlan's composure flickered just for a heartbeat before smoothing back into place. "That's a serious accusation to level at a man with no evidence behind it whatsoever." "I don't need evidence to know a snake when one's coiled up in front of me smiling," Clara said, and she felt Caleb step up close beside her, silent, immovable, a wall of quiet fury that needed no words to make its meaning clear. "You'd do well to watch your tongue." "Clara," Harlan said, and for the first time the mask slipped fully away, revealing something colder and uglier underneath. Accusations like that spoken carelessly in a town full of listening ears could do considerable damage to whatever reputation you've got left. "My reputation isn't the one that ought to worry about damage, Mr. Pike." Something dangerous flashed behind Harlan's eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual careful, composed mask. "I'll leave you to your grief then," he said, straightening his coat with exaggerated dignity. "Do think on my offer, Clara. Fires have a way of returning to places that haven't learned their lesson the first time." He left without waiting for a response, and the moment the door swung shut behind him, Caleb's hand found the small of Clara's back, steady grounding. "That was a threat," Clara whispered. "He just threatened to burn me out again, plain as day, in front of witnesses." "I heard it," Caleb said, grim. "And so did half the street, I'd wager, given how loud he pitched his voice on the way out." Something calculating entered his expression, quick and sharp. "Man's getting careless, Clara. Desperate men always do sooner or later. Cole's right that we need proof solid enough to hold in a courtroom. But Harlan Pike just handed us something almost as good, standing in your shop, threatening you in front of God and everybody." "Will it be enough?" "Might not be alone," Caleb admitted. "But paired with whatever Cole found buried in that county paperwork, it might just be the thread that unravels this whole ugly business." His jaw tightened. "I aim to make sure it does one way or another." That night, Clara stood at her mended window and lit the lantern with hands that trembled not from fear this time, but from a fury that had been building steadily for weeks. Fury at a town too cowardly to name a monster in its midst, simply because he wore fine coats and carried a banker's respectable title. Caleb stood beside her, watching the small flame catch and steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet certainty that settled something restless in Clara's chest. "You're not backing down," he said. "Not a question." "No," Clara said. "I buried my husband and my daughter. Both Caleb and I let this town's cruelty nearly convince me I deserve to disappear along with them. I am done disappearing. Whatever Harlan Pike thinks he can burn out of me, he's sorely mistaken about what's left to burn." "That's the woman I've been falling for," Caleb said, quiet, like the words had slipped free before he'd fully decided to say them. Clara turned to look at him, startled, and found him watching her with an expression stripped bare of every wall he usually kept carefully in place. "Caleb, I know it's not the time," he said, quick, almost apologetic. "Man ought to have better sense than to say a thing like that with your storeroom still smelling of smoke and a snake like Pike circling closer every day. But I've held it in long enough, and I figure life's too short and too uncertain to keep holding back things worth saying." He reached up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "I'm falling for you, Clara Whitmore. Been falling since the night you opened your door to a stranger in a storm, and didn't ask a single question you didn't need answered right then. Figured you ought to know it, whatever comes next." Clara's eyes filled with tears, the good kind this time, the kind that came from a heart cracking open rather than breaking apart. "I'm afraid to say it back," she admitted. "Afraid that loving you means I have to let go of loving them. And I don't know how to do both at once." "Don't reckon you have to choose," Caleb said, gentle. "Grief and love ain't enemies, Clara. Man can carry both at the same time if he's willing to bear the weight of it. I know, 'cause I've watched you do exactly that every night you lit that lantern for the family you lost, right alongside every evening you've spent laughing with me over supper." Clara closed the small distance between them, resting her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady, unhurried beat of his heart. "I think I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, Caleb Brooks. I think I do." His arms tightened around her, And for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern flame steady and warm in the window beside them, casting its small, stubborn light out into a town that had tried twice now to snuff it out entirely, and failed both times. Outside, somewhere in the dark, Harlan Pike sat in his fine house calculating his next move, unaware that the very violence he'd unleashed to break Clara Whitmore had instead forged something between her and the drifter she'd taken in, that no threat, no fire, no rumor would ever be strong enough to burn back down to ash. 2 days later, Sheriff Cole rode back into town with a look on his face that told Clara before he'd said a single word that whatever he'd found had changed everything. "I need you both to sit down," Cole said, dismounting. Slow, deliberate, a man carrying news heavy enough to require careful handling. "What I found out at that county office, Clara, it's not just about Harlan Pike wanting your land." "Then what is it about?" Clara asked, dread pooling cold in her stomach. Cole's eyes were grave. "It's about your husband." Clara's hand found Caleb's without her deciding to reach for it, gripping tight enough to hurt. "What about my husband?" Cole pulled a folded paper from inside his coat, worn soft at the creases from handling, and set it carefully on the counter between them. "This is a copy of a note filed at the county recorder dated 3 weeks before the mine collapse that killed Matthew," Cole said. "It's addressed to the county land office, requesting they flag any future transaction on the Whitmore property as suspect, pending his personal review. Matthew's own hand, near as I can tell, matched against other paper of his I found in the old land office files." "I don't understand," Clara whispered, though some cold, creeping dread was already beginning to understand for her. "Your husband suspected something was wrong before he died," Cole said, gentle but relentless. "The way a man delivers news he knows will cut deep, regardless of how carefully he handles it. I went back further, Clara. Found records of Matthew making inquiries at the assay office about mine safety violations at the very claim where he died. Filed complaints twice about equipment Harlan Pike's mining concern had supplied to that operation. Equipment Pike's company was contracted to inspect and certify safe." The room seemed to tilt around Clara, the walls pressing close, the lantern's flame swimming in her vision. "Are you saying," she managed barely above a whisper, "that Harlan Pike had something to do with the mine collapse? That Matthew's death wasn't an accident?" "I'm saying there's enough smoke here that I can't in good conscience call it nothing," Cole said. "I can't prove murder, Clara, not with what I've got in hand right now. But I can prove your husband raised serious safety concerns about equipment tied directly to Harlan Pike's business concerns that went unanswered right up until the day that mine came down and killed him along with 6 other men. And I can prove somebody filed forged loan paperwork against your land not 1 month after his death paperwork. That's let Pike hold leverage over this property ever since." Caleb's grip on Clara's hand tightened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a fury so controlled it frightened her more than any shout could have. "He killed her husband," Caleb said flat, "to clear the way for whatever he wanted with this land, and then he spent 3 years slowly starving her out of her own home, so he could finish what that mine collapse started." "I can't say that with certainty yet," Cole cautioned. "What I've got proves negligence may be worse, and it proves fraud on that loan paperwork clean as day. Whether Pike deliberately engineered that collapse to kill your husband specific, or whether Matthew simply died because Pike's greed made him careless about safety and convenient about opportunity afterward, that's a distinction a judge is going to care about a great deal, even if it don't matter much to either of us sitting here." Clara sat down hard in the nearest chair, her legs no longer willing to hold her weight, and stared at the note in Matthew's careful hand, the same hand that had written, "For Clara, always safe," in the back of an old ledger, and she understood now, with a grief so sharp it stole her breath entirely, exactly what her husband had been trying to protect her from. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew something was wrong, and he tried to stop it, and it killed him before he ever got the chance to warn me properly." "He left you everything he could," Cole said quiet. "That flagged filing these complaints that pressed flower with its 4 words man was trying to build you a shield from beyond the grave. Clara best he knew how with the time he had left." Clara pressed the paper to her chest, tears falling freely now. Grief and fury and a strange aching gratitude all tangled together into something she had no name for. Why didn't anyone find this sooner? She demanded, though the anger wasn't truly aimed at Cole. 3 years and no one thought to look. Because nobody had reason to look until a stranger showed up asking questions Pike didn't want asked. Cole said with a nod toward Caleb that carried real respect in it. Sometimes it takes an outsider, somebody without 3 years of this town's assumptions baked into him, to notice what everybody else has learned to look past. Caleb knelt beside Clara's chair, taking her free hand in both of his steady, despite the fury still simmering visibly beneath his composure. "This is enough to move on him," he said, looking to Cole. "Ain't it fraud at the very least? Enough to arrest him, force this whole rotten business into the light where the whole town has to look at it." "It's enough to bring before a judge," Cole said. "Might take some weeks yet, building the case tight enough that Pike's lawyer friends can't wriggle him free of it entire. But yes, it's a start. The strongest start we've had since this whole business began." Clara wiped at her eyes, drawing a steadying breath, and when she looked up at Caleb, something had settled in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not less grief, not less fear, but a new and fierce determination laid over both like armor. "Then we build the case," she said. "Whatever weeks it takes, whatever proof still needs finding, I want to see this through to the end. Not just for my shop, or even for me. For Matthew. For every family Harlan Pike ever ruined to build his fortune." Her voice steadied further with every word. "For every widow he thought would be too broken and too frightened to fight back. That's exactly the woman I fell for." Caleb said quiet, and Cole, watching the two of them, allowed himself the ghost of a smile despite the grim business at hand. "I'll ride out again tomorrow," Cole said, gathering his hat. "Dig deeper into that mining claims inspection records, see if I can't find the paper trail that ties Pike's company directly to the safety violations Matthew flagged. In the meantime, both of you keep your guard up. A man cornered the way. Pike's about to be cornered, don't always go quiet. And he's already shown he's willing to burn down more than paperwork to protect whatever he thinks he's owed." He left them alone in the shop as evening settled gold and heavy over Mercy Ridge, the mended window catching the last of the daylight, the scorched storeroom standing as silent testimony to exactly how far Harlan Pike was willing to go to keep his secrets buried. Clara stood slowly still, holding Matthew's note pressed to her chest, and walked to the front window, where the lantern waited unlit for the coming dark. "He tried to protect me," she said, half to Caleb, half to the empty street beyond the glass. "Even knowing something was wrong, even with whatever time he had left, Matthew spent it trying to build me a shield instead of running to save himself." "Sounds like a good man," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. "He was." Clara struck the match, lighting the wick with hands that no longer trembled. "And I intend to make sure his death means something more than a line in a mining company's negligence report. I intend to make sure Harlan Pike answers for every single thing he's taken from this town." The flame caught and steadied small and stubborn against the coming night, and Clara Whitmore stood in its warm glow beside the man she'd nearly turned away in a storm, no longer merely surviving her grief, but finally fiercely ready to fight for the truth buried beneath it. Ruth came by the next morning breathless, having heard some fractured version of the news already racing through Mercy Ridge's ever-hungry rumor mill, and she gathered Clara into a fierce hug the moment she stepped through the door. "Is it true?" Ruth demanded, pulling back to search Clara's face. "What they're saying about Matthew, about the mine, about Pike's paper on your land being forged all along?" "It's true," Clara said. "Or true enough that Cole means to bring it before a judge." Ruth's face crumpled, grief and fury warring openly across her features. "That monster. All this time sitting in his fine house letting this whole town treat you like you'd lost your mind over a lantern, when he's the one who ought to have been run out on a rail." "The town believed what was easiest to believe," Clara said, echoing what she'd told Caleb days before, though the words tasted less bitter, now tempered by the strange, fierce hope building steadily in her chest. "I don't blame them for it entirely, Ruth. I blame Harlan Pike for building a lie sturdy enough that an entire town found it easier to trust than the truth standing right in front of them." "Well, the truth's not standing quiet any longer," Ruth said, squeezing Clara's hands. "Whatever you need. Clara Whitmore, whatever this fight costs you before it's through, you've got Silas and me standing with you. No more hiding, no more silence. This town owes you that much at the very least." Clara felt tears threaten again, though these came gentler than the grief-soaked tears of days before, born instead from the simple, overwhelming relief of no longer standing entirely alone against the weight of what was coming. "Thank you," she said quiet, "for believing me when believing cost you something with half this town." "Wasn't ever hard to believe you, honey," Ruth said. "Was only ever hard to say it loud enough for Harlan Pike to hear." That evening, as the sun dropped low behind the ridge and painted Mercy Ridge in shades of amber and rust, Clara sat on the shop's front step beside Caleb Matthews' note-folded safe in her apron pocket and watched the town she'd once felt utterly abandoned by begin slowly, cautiously to turn its collective gaze toward the truth it had spent 3 years too frightened to face. "Cole thinks it'll take weeks yet," she said, building a case strong enough to hold. "Weeks we can manage," Caleb set his hand finding hers on the worn wooden step. "Long as we're managing them together." Clara leaned into him, watching the last light fade over the ridge, and for the first time since Matthew's death, she found she was not afraid of what the coming days might bring. Whatever weeks of fighting still lay ahead, whatever Harlan Pike still had left in him to throw at her, she no longer faced it as a lonely widow keeping a lantern burning for ghosts. She faced it as a woman who had finally remembered exactly how much fight she still had left in her standing beside a man who had chosen against every instinct that had driven him from town to town for 3 long years to finally stop running and stay. Harlan Pike did not take the accusation lying down. Within 2 days of Cole's revelation, word began circulating through Mercy Ridge that the sheriff himself had gone soft in the head, chasing phantom conspiracies to please a widow who'd taken up with a drifter of questionable character. Harlan did not spread this version of events personally. He was too careful a man for that, too practiced in the art of letting other mouths carry his poison for him, but Clara recognized his fingerprints all over the whispers just the same. "He's calling a town meeting," Ruth reported, breathless, arriving at the shop with the news still hot on her tongue. "Tomorrow evening at the Grange Hall. Says he means to address, and I'm quoting here, Clara, troubling rumors that threaten the good name of respected members of this community." "He means himself," Clara said. "He means to get ahead of whatever Cole's building before it reaches a judge." Caleb said, grim, standing at the counter with his arms crossed, jaw set in the hard line it had taken to wearing more often than not lately. "Smart man wouldn't wait to be accused in a courtroom if he could shape the whole town's opinion first in a room where he controls who speaks and who don't. Then we go." Clara said, immediate no hesitation in it. "Whatever he means to say about me, about you, about Matthew's death, I won't have him saying it to a room full of people while I hide here, pretending I've got something to be ashamed of." Caleb studied her for a long moment, something like pride warring with worry behind his eyes. "That room's going to be ugly, Clara. Half that town spent weeks whispering things about you they'd never dare say to your face. Man like Harlan gets them all in one room riled up, and looking for somebody to blame could turn uglier than either of us wants to imagine." "I've survived uglier," Clara said. "I buried a husband and a daughter and kept standing. I think I can survive one evening in a Grange Hall." Ruth squeezed her hand fierce. "You won't be standing there alone, honey. Silas and I mean to be right there beside you, whatever Harlan Pike's got planned to say." The Grange Hall was packed the following evening. Benches filled shoulder to shoulder with nearly every family in Mercy Ridge, and Clara felt the weight of every eye that turned toward her the moment she stepped through the door beside Caleb Ruth and Silas Dawson, flanking them both like a wall of quiet, defiant support. Harlan Pike stood at the front of the room, already composed and immaculate in his finest coat, and when his gaze found Clara across the crowded hall, his smile carried something sharp and satisfied beneath its practiced warmth. "Friends," he began, once the room had settled, "I've called you together tonight because I believe this community deserves the truth, plain and unvarnished, about matters that have caused considerable distress among our neighbors these past weeks. Here it comes," Caleb murmured low enough only Clara could hear. "There have been suggestions," Harlan continued, pacing slow before the assembled crowd, troubling suggestions that I bear some responsibility for the mine collapse that took Matthew Whitmore's life 3 years past. Suggestions further that I've engaged in fraud against his widow's property. He paused, letting the accusation hang heavy in the room, letting every eye that hadn't already found Clara find her now. I understand grief does strange things to a person's judgment. I understand a lonely widow taken with a drifter who arrived in this town with no history worth vouching for might grasp at wild explanations rather than accept simple tragic misfortune. A murmur rippled through the hall, and Clara felt her face go hot with fury and humiliation both. "He's twisting it," she whispered. "Let him talk," Caleb said, quiet steady. "Give a man enough rope, Clara, and sooner or later he hangs himself with it. I have nothing to hide." Harlan continued spreading his hands wide before the crowd, the picture of wounded innocence. "My business dealings, my mining investments, all matters of public record for any who care to examine them. I've built my fortune honestly through hard work and sound judgment, same as any man in this room.